today, let's talk about our next step here, about how we need to move along in our Christian faith. This whole series in this part 2 of Believe is about how do we act as a Christian? How do we act like Jesus? And today we're going to talk about this idea of total surrender. Let's just move on to the next slide there. I want to look at our key question. It's how do we cultivate a life of sacrificial service? The key theme is I dedicate my life to God's purposes. That's the big idea today. That surrender means I dedicate my life to God's purposes. And the key verse for this week, remember we're trying to encourage adults to memorize the Bible verses. I hope you're cutting out the cards, and if you have lost all the cards for this, there's leftovers out in the Welcome Center, so grab the teaching outlines and just cut these out. So let's say this together right now. Here's our surrender verse for the day. Let's say it together. I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. I mean, you can hear right in that verse about how we're called to surrender our life to God's ways. You know, speaking of surrender, I remember when I was young, hearing from my parents about a young man who surrendered his life as a missionary, that he ended up being killed because he was reaching out to an indigenous group of people in Ecuador, known as the Aka. That was the sort of the North American term. The actual proper indigenous term, we find out later, is the Huaorani people. Now, these Huaorani people had never been before exposed to the Christian message, and this young man, along with 4 other young men, really felt called by God to say, let's go down and reach out to these people. Kind of a neat way, they first of all tried to reach them into the deep jungles of Ecuador. They actually had a little plane where they dropped a bucket. They flew in a circle and dropped a bucket down, and the bucket actually just came to a standstill down, hundreds of feet down as the plane flew around the circle, and they offered some gifts, and they were offering some food and whatnot. And eventually, they landed near a river called the Caragay River, I believe, Carguay or something like that. And they landed there, and they made an initial contact with one of the tribe members of the Huaorani people. And he met them, and they befriended him, and he came and visited them a few times. And then something very horrible and tragic happened. All of a sudden, on a day where they thought they were going to make more contact with more of the people from the tribe, and just begin to share a conversation and try to be a witness as they shared their faith in Jesus, 10 tribal guys came out with spears, chased them down the river, killing each one at a time, and they were all found murdered in that Caragay River. You know, as we think about that, I always thought about that story. Now, why it impacted my parents so much, my parents are now 80 years of age, is that these were young people their age who all had gone, some had gone to a Bible college and others had gone to university, but they all felt called to reach out to these people as Christians. They were all between the ages of 25 to 30. And that's very powerful for me now because I got young sons, adult sons who are all in that age group. And I'm trying to imagine if I got news that my son Tom had been murdered as he was trying to do some work for God, and he felt called to do that. And of course, for some of you who are older ones, you already know who I'm talking about because the leader of that 5 men, his name was Jim Elliot. And there was a movie made probably a few years ago. You can Google it. It's called Through the Gates of Splendor. And it talks about these 5 young missionary men who were murdered as they were reaching out to the Huaorani people. Now, Jim Elliot wrote probably about 5 years before in his journal, he wrote this, which became a famous quote as people were both impacted and celebrating his life. He wrote, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." And as we think about surrender today, we think about stories like that. And one of the things as we think about what it means to live out our Christian faith, we get this sense that we're called to be willing to surrender it all. And I'll be honest with you, I think that sometimes we find that hard to really understand. What does it really mean to surrender it all? I mean, we're confronted with these stories where people of faith through the Bible were willing to surrender it all because of their faith in God. They were actually saying this: I believe there's something more important than even life itself. And let's be honest, we live in a culture that says, no, life is all you got. And we want it to be as good and as wonderful as possible. But these people of faith throughout the Bible said, yes, it is wonderful, it's beautiful, let's enjoy it. But you know what? But there's still something even more important than life that I'm willing to surrender if I have to. I mean, one great story I remember growing up and listening to when my mom read me Bible stories was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's some great gospel quartet songs about that, you know. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right, were young Israel men who were captured by the Babylonian Empire when the fall of the southern kingdom of Israel happened. They were taken to Babylon to be trained to serve the king. And in the midst of that training, they were presented a huge dilemma. King Nebuchadnezzar had built this huge statue, and he said, I want everybody to bow down before it, and if you don't bow down, I have a blazing furnace reserved for you, really hot spot. And let me just read how they responded. Oh, and they responded like good young men do. I love this. Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He'll rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never, and I mean never, I'm adding that, serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up. Now, did you notice that? You talk about, there's a moment, total surrender. And think about it. All they needed to do to get past that moment was just do this, just for a moment, and say, well, I'm not surrendering my heart. They could have rationalized it. But they refused to bow down. Instead, they said, go ahead, Nebuchadnezzar. Throw me in the furnace. God's going to save me. And even if he doesn't, I'm not bowing down. Total surrender. Obviously, they felt that there was something more important than life itself. Another story. The guys aren't the only heroes in the Bible, remember? Women are too. I love Esther. Esther, right? She was in the Persian court, and there was very evil people who wanted to destroy the Jewish people, and they had got the king of Persia to issue an edict for all the other people to attack the Jewish people. But Esther, who was in the royal court, had the opportunity to be political and smart and sophisticated and intervene on their behalf. But she knew that this was very dangerous, because back then, it isn't like today. And she said, I could enter that inner court of the king, and if I'm not invited, I could be killed on the spot. So she decides, though, and her uncle goes after her, Uncle Mordecai, and they talk and they debate and they struggle, and she struggles. But finally, she says to her uncle, listen to this, and here's a surrender statement. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I, my attendants, will fast as you do. And when this is done, I'll go to the king, even though it's against the law. And here's her famous surrender line. And if I perish, I perish. There's a surrender statement. It's interesting too, right? In the New Testament, we see surrender as well. Total surrender. Where people are saying there's something more important than life itself. I think about how we often think about the beginning of the Christian church. We think about Christmas, in a way, in the manger. And we love all that sort of nice, warm bed of hay. Away in the manger, this is so cute. Let's sing about it more and let's think about it all the time. And you know what the problem is? It's that a big part of the beginning of the Christian church was bathed in blood. There was a real surrender cost. In Acts, when you read the book of Acts, which talks about the beginning of the Christian church there, it talks about the very first martyr. Oh, by the way, does anybody know what the word martyr means? Martyr means witness. And the very first witness who bore witness to the fact that their life had to be sacrificed was Stephen. He was an elder in the church. He might have been a congregational pastor, Seth. But he helped the widows. He was a good teacher. He was a leader. And he finds himself all of a sudden pulled in front of the religious leaders of the day. And he doesn't pull back because he's telling them there's something more important than just my little life. And I'm going to tell you about Jesus, and I'm going to tell you about how God had a plan all through the scriptures, and it pointed towards the righteous one, which then he ends off his sermon, very prophetic sermon, where he says, and you disobeyed, and in fact, you killed the righteous one. Not exactly a warm, encouraging, devotional message. And I love what happens next. Here's the reaction. In Acts 7, we read this. And when the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, they were furious, and they gnashed their teeth at him. Just as a little aside, I always think when I preach, I should have a little gnashing of teeth every once in a while. If you're always walking out smiling, I don't think I'm doing my job. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And this they covered their ears, and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him and dragged him out of the city, and they began to stone him. And meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. Interesting, right in the midst of a horrific, evil moment of surrender, and yet this guy surrendering his life. It was the beginning of Saul, who would later become Paul, who would write most of the New Testament. Oh, fascinating. And then it says, while they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And then he fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. And when he said this, he fell asleep. That's AKA he died from head injuries and trauma. I mean, talk about total surrender. When I hear these stories, I realize that what I'm being told is this. There is something more important than life itself. These people saw something. They had a vision of faith and life that, if we're honest, sometimes we struggle to have. You know, my question is do you understand that there's something more important than life itself? Jesus said yes to this question. In Luke chapter 9, he says this phrase about what it means to be a follower of him. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. Do you know how hard that little line by Jesus is? Whoever wants to, again, save their life will lose it, but whoever wants to lose their life for me will save it. See, I think a lot of us wake up every day, if we're honest, and we're thinking about me. We're thinking about our plans. We're thinking about our calendars. We're thinking about our schedules. We're thinking about where we're going to go, what we're going to do, what we're going to experience, all the fun in life. And yet Jesus comes along and says, whoever wants to really save their life has to be prepared to surrender their life. And you're going, well, that puts a kink in my plans. Jesus reminds us in this statement that I'm convinced it sounds very strange in our consumeristic culture. Because our consumeristic culture makes the customer, us, the center of all reality. And I'm showing my age now. For those of you who remember the co-op store down on Record Street, remember they had two rules that they followed, and it was painted on the back of the red brick building. I always love these two rules. Rule number 1, the customer is always right. Rule number 2, go back to rule number 1, right? And the thing is, what that was saying is that if we live by consumeristic values, then that means that the self is the center, and we are going to focus on things that make us feel safe and secure and happy. And the whole idea of surrender, not in a consumeristic culture, it's all about me. But Jesus says, but if you really want to save your life, you got to be willing to lose it. You know, as we hear this call to surrender, Jesus would say other things like this. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up the cross. The cross, by the way, was an execution weapon. It'd be like Jesus saying today, whoever wants to, be my disciple must take up their lethal injection and follow me. What good is it, Jesus went on to say, for someone to gain the whole world but lose their soul, lose their very self? Jesus is saying there's something greater to this life. The early Christians also said there's something greater than just life itself. Paul had been called by God to share who Jesus was. Remember, Paul, let's go to the next slide, was the Saul where when Stephen was being martyred, he had the clothes laid at his feet. Well, this Saul met Jesus in a dramatic way on Damascus Road, and guess what happened? This Saul became Paul, and Paul became one of the very first early Christian missionaries as he both wrote about faith and as he went and shared faith and planted churches all throughout Asia Minor. But at the end of his missionary journeys, he's with some Christians. And one of the prophets in the church gives him a prophetic word. And they actually take the belt off and grab and put it around Paul and said, Paul, you're going to be bound and led. And all the Christians say, Paul, don't go. Don't leave us. Because if you go, you're going to die. And what does Paul say? Here's a surrender statement. Then Paul answered, why are you weeping and breaking my heart? I am ready not only to be bound, but also to go to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus. You know, Paul's reminding us here that there is something more important than just life itself, that there is something we need to be willing to surrender our life for. Paul's reminding us with this sort of big statement, I'm not only willing to be bound and be put in prison, but I'm willing to die for the Lord Jesus. He's saying that part of serving at times will mean opposition. Part of living out God's will is going to be difficult. Sometimes there will be suffering. Sometimes there will be sacrifice. And in Paul's case, it even meant death. But what matters, Paul is saying, is that we are willing to surrender our purposes for the purposes of God. So my question is this: will you say yes? The early Christians said yes, there's something more important than life itself. Jesus says there's something more important than life itself. Will you surrender? Will you say yes? When we're willing to say what Paul wrote here, for me to live as Christ and to die as gain, he's saying, when you move deep into your faith, you want to say, Jesus, if you're the Lord of all, if you're King of all, then you're Lord and King of my life. And I need to live each day with the mind of Christ. I need to live each day where I'll seek first God's kingdom. I'll live each day where I'll seek to do the good that you want me to do, the very good that you planned in advance for me to do. Because it's no longer about me. I need to have a prayer of what's called indifference, where I say, Lord, anything that's not within your will, make me indifferent to. Make me indifferent to it. Now, the thing is, I'll still be honest with you, though. Here's the part that's wild for me. It's just a little bit of an aside. Is that I still think in our culture, we have such a hard time thinking that this whole idea that are we prepared to have such deep faith in God that we're willing to have our lives surrendered, like that we'd be willing to die for it. I mean, we live in North America. We live in Moncton. I mean, this whole thing about Jim Elliot being chased by spears down in some, Ecuador river or being thrown into a blazing furnace like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or like Stephen being stoned. I mean, in our culture today, people don't get killed for their, wait a sec. People do get killed for their faith. January 29th. Shooter walked in and killed people who were Muslims and praying. Was it a year ago? A young man by the name of Roof walked into a prayer meeting, and then he was invited in, and they prayed for him, and then he shot them all. Or for those of you who've been seeing the horror of ISIS, wasn't it? Coptic Christians were led out onto a beach 3 or 4 years ago, all executed because they were Christians. They didn't die because of their economic stance or their political position. They died because they said, I believe in Christ. Gosh, I guess this is a little closer home than we want to. Yeah. You see, when we talk about surrender, we have to come to this place. We will say yes to surrendering our purposes to God's purposes when we get a deeper and wider vision of Jesus, when we start to really say what it means to live out our life in God's rule, God's kingdom, where we start to understand that God calls us to do good works, that he planned in advance for us to do. And those good works, can I tell you, are not going to be easy. They're going to require hard work. They're going to require opposition. They're going to require sacrifice, misunderstanding, and it will inconvenience you. It will inconvenience me. But you see, it's not an inconvenience when we surrender. And when we start to get this, we'll start to see that there is now, we can say, you know what? We can say to our kids, we can say to our grandchildren, we can say, you know what? There's something more important than just life itself. It's not just about having a good life. God, of course, wants us to have a good life. But what did Jesus say? If you really want a good life, you got to be willing to lose it in order to save it. So let me ask you this last question. What area are you resisting into surrender? That's where I want to end up. What area are you resisting? What area am I resisting? Can I be honest with you? You know, this whole idea of total surrender sounds really noble, but I've been at this for years, decades. And I still don't know if I have a totally surrendered heart. Because here's the reality. I find that surrender has to happen in the moment. And it often depends on, first of all, the spectrum of my life. So maybe for some of you right now, the issue of surrender is around your work, where you need to say, God, is this the work you want me to do? And am I working the way you want me to? Maybe for some of you, you need to surrender in your marriage. Maybe you've been growing up saying, I'm going to do my marriage the way my dad taught me. Well, maybe you should surrender that and say, Jesus, help me to love my wife as you love the church. Or maybe it's in the area of parenting where you say, it's time for me to surrender my pride and tell my kids that I don't know everything and that I'm going to love them and I'm going to ask them for their forgiveness. I got to surrender that. Or maybe it's another area of your life where you're saying, this part, God, hands off, this is my part. I don't want to surrender this. I just want this for me. You know, it's not only just the spectrum of our life we need to surrender where we may be resisting. We may be resisting something deep down in our hearts. You know, maybe for some of us, we're resisting and saying, God, I got some bitterness I'm holding on to, and I'm not going to surrender that. Maybe for some of us, we would rather worry than trust God. and we're not going to surrender our worry. Our worry almost makes us feel good. For others of us, we feel hurt. We don't feel, people don't talk to me enough. People don't pay attention to me when I come into church even. And I'm walking around all angry inside. And God's saying, it's time you surrender that, Dave. It's time you surrender that. It's time you learn about what loving means in a whole new way. You know, when we talk about this whole surrender stuff, let me just finish with two quick little stories. You see, I think surrender really does happen in the moment. Can I take you back to Jim Elliot, the 28-year-old who died reaching out to the Hanoi people? He was married. And I can't help but think about Elizabeth Elliot. I couldn't help but think that she could have been so angry. She could have been so upset. She could have said, you know, Jim was a very talented man, very gifted speaker. He could have been a pastor of probably a very successful large church in America at the time. But he didn't do all that. And her whole life was destroyed. Now, would that be grounds for bitterness? Would that be grounds to get angry and say, God, I'm just being honest. I think I'd feel that. But what did Elizabeth do? You know what she did? She surrendered all that need for revenge and bitterness and hate, and instead she said, Jesus, help me to go your way. And you know what happened? If you watch the story, you go Google it, or there's a movie called Through Gates of Splendor. Here's the wild part of this whole story. Elizabeth ends up going back to that very place and reaches out to the Harani people, and one of the very first people she leads to Christ is, guess who? The person who had betrayed her husband and the 4 other young men. And eventually that whole tribe came to know Christ. See, that's surrender. God's kingdom's built when we surrender. Can I tell you one other really quick little cool story about surrender? And this is just, because I find, can I be honest with you? I think a lot of times surrender is tied to our time and our money. Can I just say that? Ken Shigematsu, who's on our leadership at World Vision at the board level, he was sharing a neat story this past weekend, last weekend when I was there for World Vision meetings. Ken Shigematsu wrote a book about 4 years ago called God Am I Everything. Actually, we used that as a series here, if you remember it. And Ken Shigematsu was sharing about the dynamics of writing that book. And actually, it was kind of an encouragement. I've been saying, God, you're asking me to write something, but it was kind of a neat story that he shared that kind of it was really how God worked. But he went to the publisher and he said, I want to write a book about these ancient practices, spiritual practices, so that rather than just having a devotion in the morning, I'm really practicing God in my everything, God in every one of my moments. And the publisher, you know what they said to him? Look, people are busy today. It's 21st century, Ken. They're not going to be interested in reading a book like this. But hey, if you're prepared to write up the manuscript, we'll at least do a small printing. So he did. And just at that moment, and here's the part I want you to catch, just at that moment, while he was going through all that, he felt God asking him to say, whatever profits I make, I'm going to give to World Vision and to some other organizations to help the poor children of the world. And so he surrendered all of his profits for that purpose. Now, on one hand, to be honest, he was told, you're going to have a small print, small run, you might make a few dollars. So he thought, well, I'll just hand that over. Well, what he didn't know is that within the next 3 years, it would become a best-selling book. It's already been translated in multiple languages. And so Ken was sharing, he didn't tell the exact number, and so I got corrected at the other service, so I got to say it a little more correctly for you accountant types. But it was either, I heard him say it was either a 6-figure or 7-figure check he's writing for World Vision. Yeah, okay, someone's listening to the story. Now, here's the thing I want you to catch about surrender. It's one thing to maybe be caught up in this moment and say, yes, Lord, I'm going to surrender this part of my life to you. I'm going to let it go. But here's the reality. You will surrender it today, but can I guarantee you something? You will need to surrender it every single day. Because can I be, honest, Dave, with you, if I was Ken? It's one thing to say, yeah, okay, if I raise $10,000 for World Vision, yeah. And then all of a sudden I start getting updates from the publisher every month. Oh, we sold another 100,000. Oh, we sold another 50,000 books. Oh, whoa. And yet Ken made that decision to surrender up front. But he has to live with the consequences of that surrender every day. What is going to go through Ken's mind if 5 years from now he has a health issue and he loses his job and he doesn't have any money coming in? What's going to go through his mind? If he's honest, I know I'd be honest. That's what surrender means. That Ken is saying, and we all have these moments. We may not write a best-selling book. We may not be the wife of a missionary killed in Ecuador. We may not be in Babylon times where we're being thrown into a blazing furnace. But I can guarantee you this. In these days ahead, in these moments of your life ahead, you're going to come to moments where you're going to say, God, is it your will or is it my will? God, how do you want me to be about your purposes through your church in this world of need, in the time that you give me? Am I willing to surrender to your way? Now we're going to invite the Seth to come up, lead us in the Lord's Supper, and our service will come to a conclusion.